All right, so I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again briefly here, and it's pretty lazily put together. But you're going to get, if you haven't heard this before, you may interest you, pique your interest. So we're going to compare and relate GME and 9/11, and we're going to see just how deep does this rabbit hole go. And the reason why I'm talking about this is due to the latest 144 that was just filed by GameStop that just came out, because I couldn't help but look at it and I saw, Morgan Stanley Smith Barney, and I just can't help myself. So let's go ahead and look into this. So, way back in the 70s, 60s, really, I mean, Salomon was founded back in 1910. They have a very long history, but they really started getting involved with some questionable things like derivatives and things like that, betting on consumer credit back in the 60s when they joined Lehman Brothers, Blythe and Merrill Lynch to become the fearsome foursome. That's one of the first major big things they've done post World War II. Now, as far as the 80s, everybody knows there was a flash crash in 1987. This flash crash was actually caused by traders in Salomon Brothers that were trying to corner the treasury market, or bond market specifically. And trader Paul Moser submitted illegal bids for U.S. Treasury securities in August of 1990, attempting to corner the market by purchasing more than 35% share allowed per individual transaction. So this is the second time. It's attributed to the 1987 crash, but 2 years later, they did it again, and the SEC actually found out this time. They noticed, and they held a hearing on it, and things like that. So essentially, before all this even started, when we look at World Trade Center 7, this building was purchased by Salomon Brothers in 1988. And Larry Silverstein was the developer, and he had a ground lease for the site from the Port Authority in New York and New Jersey. The original 7 World Trade Center was 47 stories tall, clad in red granite masonry, and occupied a trapezoidal footprint. An elevated walkway spanning Vesey Street connected the building to the World Trade Center Plaza. The building was situated above Consolidated Edison Power substation, which imposed unique structural design constraints. When the building opened in 1987, Silverstein had difficulties attracting tenants. That's where Salomon Brothers came in right after the big 1987 scandal and signed a long-term lease in 1988 and became the main tenant of WTC 7. So this is all prior to the hearing that took place in 1991. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because our own man, our old boy, Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve chair that currently sits in the chair, let's go over some of his background information. He established a greater Hill presence than former chairs. While often right-leaning, Powell takes an apolitical approach to financial governance. His policy position and areas of focus: he is a monetary centrist who favors limiting regulations and expanding the economy, but prefers a gentle approach. Interest rates: strays from both the hawkish approach of withholding stimulus as well as the dovish aggressive stimulation. You can read the rest if you want. The important part of this is the core communities. So Powell has many friends on both the Hill and on Wall Street, and has leveraged those connections well for upward movement. Then we look at the Wall Street executives. A former investment banker himself, Powell is in favor with other prominent investors. Stephen Munich, Secretary of the Treasury, lobbied for Powell to become the chair and has stood by him despite President Trump's criticisms. Warren Buffett, business magnate, was made the chair of Salomon Brothers in 1990 into the investigation, and he became the interim CEO of the company. And he later endorsed Powell for the Fed chairmanship. Now, here's where it gets super, super interesting. Whenever the investigation initially took place into Salomon Brothers, guess who led that investigation? No one else but Jerome Powell. So the same dude that's in our Fed chair now was the same guy that led the investigation into the Salomon Brothers scandal into the 1980s and 90s, as it says right here, after Powell led an investigation against the group, being Salomon Brothers, in the early 1990s. Buffett later endorsed Powell for the Fed chairmanship. So it's all interconnected, right? Oh, and by the way, another important note, Janet Yellen actually was the one who helped educate Powell on macroeconomics. Now, in May 1991, again, the firm cornered the Treasury securities market a second time. This time, the SEC noticed. Moser was suspended and Salomon was fined the highest fine ever leveraged against a bank at the time, which was a measly $290 million. Gutfreund, which was the previous CEO, was forced to resign later in that year in August, and the company was on the brink of bankruptcy. Warren Buffett had invested, surprisingly, $700 million in Salomon Brothers in 1987, prior to all this happening, and proved to be the best choice for assuming the position of chairman in the 9 months following Gutfreund's forced resignation. Buffett didn't like spending time away from Berkshire Hathaway and sent his investors a letter saying his new position was far from fun. And during the 1991 hearing or trial that took place over these matters, he said a famous quote that was amounted to this. He said, "Lose money for the firm, and I will be understanding. Lose a shred of reputation for the firm, and I will be ruthless," which is what he said in a 1991 hearing in front of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. Now, after the scandal, Salomon Brothers spread around the globe and rebranded themselves under Citigroup's giant empire. While Salomon now lives deep within the Citigroup empire, there's still a curious loyalty to the former Wall Street giant. According to the Wall Street Journal, investors as late as 2009 would call Citi and ask for Salomon. So what happened is after the scandal in 1997, they merged with Travelers Group, or they were acquired by Travelers Group, and then Travelers Group later merged with Citicorp, which became Citigroup Global Markets. Now, some important notes about some other alumni from Salomon. You have Louis Ranieri from Salomon Brothers, which he partnered with no other than Ken Griffin back in the 80s to create the Citadel infrastructure that we see today. Ken Griffin called him and was interested in, the technology aspect of the firm because, Salomon was renowned for their technological advancements back in the day. And, lo and behold, that led to Citadel markets that we see today. So Louis Ranieri and Citadel's Ken Griffin partnered and created the technology that we see today with Citadel Markets. Now, Louis Ranieri, again, that should say John Megalitz developed the mortgage-backed security, largely responsible for the '08 crisis. So you have this company, Salomon Brothers, and I'm sorry, that was actually wrong. Louis Ranieri was the one that developed the mortgage-backed securities. The guy that partnered with Ken Griffin was Tom Miglis. That was his name. So again, all tied into the Treasury scandal, flash crash 1987, '08 crisis, responsible for the first derivatives on consumer credit, basically everything under the sun. Now, here's where GameStop comes in. GameStop Incorporated, which is not GameStop as we know today, but GameStop Incorporated traces its origins back to Babbage's, a software retailer founded in Dallas, Texas in 1984 by James McCurry and Gary Kusin. Over the years, Babbage's expanded its focus into include video games, which became a significant portion of the business by the early 1990s. The company merged with Software ETC in 1994 to form Neostar Retail Group. However, Neostar faced financial difficulties and filed for bankruptcy in 1996. Leonard Riggio, chairman of Barnes & Nobles, purchased the assets and formed Babbage's ETC, which later became GameStop in 1999. In October of 1999, Barnes & Noble acquired Babbage's for $215 million, which helped GameStop grow further. Barnes & Noble then acquired another video game retailer, Funko, in 2000. These acquisitions positioned GameStop as a leading video game retailer. GameStop was officially incorporated in anticipation of its initial public offering in 2001. And guess who managed the IPO of GameStop? No other than Salomon Smith Barney's Morgan Stanley Smith Barney at that time. But at the time, the actual IPO, it was Salomon Smith Barney and UBS Warburg. And the IPO didn't go public until 2002. But the anticipation was already occurring back in 2001. So as you can see, this is all kind of creating a pretty deep rabbit hole here. Now, this is the Form 144 that just came out today. You can see here the brokerage, owner that has the, that managed the books is essentially Morgan Stanley Smith Barney, LLC. And we have some insight into the number of shares outstanding for the company, which is 351,217,517 shares. Now, when you look at the tenets of WTC7 back at the time during the the events of 9/11, look at the companies that happen to be tenants in this building. Salomon Smith Barney, Salmon Smith Barney, Standard Chartered Bank, Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, the NYC Office of Emergency Management, Federal Home Loan Bank, Hartford Financial Services Group, U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Provident Bank, American Express, Securities and Exchange Commission. I mean, Secret Service on multiple floors. So, arguably, some of the most renowned and biggest governmental agencies in existence at the time. Then you have, again, the Internal Revenue Service, the Secret Service, ITT Hartford Insurance Group, Federal Home Loan Bank, the SEC, the New York City Office of Emergency Management. So nothing more than financial institutions and government and insurance. So is it ringing any bells yet? Now, when we look at the final report on the collapse of WTC 7, when we look into this report, we can see here, as it reads, unlike the case for the two WTC towers, there was no widespread spraying of jet fuel to ignite numerous workstations or offices simultaneously. Rather, in the earlier hours of the fires following the debris' impact due to the collapse of WTC 1, the fire would have spread from one individual workstation or office to another. Thus, the fire spread would have been dependent on the office walls, the specific spacing of the cubicles, the ease of ignition in the furnishings, their combustible mass, and the extent of surface occlusion by foreign matter. There were emergency power generators in WTC 7. The diesel fuel for these generators was stored within and under WTC 7. Properties of the emergency power systems are summarized in Table 1-2, which is right here. So, again, all these renovations to this building occurred way back in 1989, right after Salomon bought this building or leased to this building, where they proceeded to remove entire floors, install diesel generators, fuel storage tank capacitors, which had two 12,000-gallon tanks in the base building system. And then Salomon Brothers had their own system where they had two 6,000-gallon tanks of diesel fuel located below the loading dock on the 5th floor. And the day tank pump location was two circulating pumps on 1st floor at 70 gallons per minute. So interesting stuff there. Now, renovations were made in 1988 and 1989 to the space leased by Salomon Brothers Incorporated in WTC 7. In 1998, Smith Barney Incorporated merged with Salomon Brothers Inc. to form Salomon Smith Barney. In 1999, Salomon Smith Barney merged with Citicorp to form Citigroup Incorporated. Now, in November 1988, Salomon Brothers withdrew from plans to build a large new complex at Columbus Circle in Midtown, which is right after the 1987 fiasco, and instead agreed to a 20-year lease. Think about this. 20 years from 1988 was when? 2008, for the top 19 floors of World Trade Center 7. The building was extensively renovated in 1989 to accommodate Salomon Brothers, and 7 World Trade Center alternatively became known as the Salomon Brothers Building. Most of the 3 existing floors were removed as tenants continued to occupy other stories, and more than 350 tons of steel were added to construct 3 double-height trading floors. 9 diesel generators were installed on the 5th floor as part of a backup power station. Quote, essentially, Salomon is constructing a building within a building. And it's an occupied building, which complicates the situation, said a district manager of Silverstein Properties. According to Larry Silverstein, the unusual task was possible because it could allow entire portions of floors to be removed without affecting the building's structural integrity, on the assumption that someone might need double height floors. So, ain't that some shit?